Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrea Pirro, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture by visiting artist Torkwase Dyson. It's an honor for us to host Torkwase at SAIC, and I would like to thank her for taking the time to share her work with us this evening. I would also like to thank Great Gallery Chicago for their support of Torkwase's visit, as well as the Illinois Arts Council Agency. Each academic year, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. In addition to public programs, our guests meet with SAIC students for various engagements, and we look forward to hosting Torkwase tomorrow for student critiques and discussion. Just a couple of notes about the format for tonight before we get started. I would like to ask you to kindly silence your cell phones at this time, and please note that video recording is not permitted. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time to take a few questions from the audience before the program concludes by 7:30. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff will circulate microphones for your use. We ask that if you're posing a question to please keep it concise so we can get to as many questions as time allows. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And now I would like to welcome to the podium Michelle Grabner, who is the Crown Family Professor of Art and Chair of the Department of Painting and Drawing at SAIC, to introduce Torkwase Dyson. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome all. As Andrea said, I am Michelle Grabner, the Crown Family Professor of Art and the current chair of the Painting and Drawing Department. I've been teaching at the School of the Art Institute since 1996. And there is a reason why Andrea invited me to introduce the remarkable and discursive artist, Torkwase Dyson. Andrea knows that I am currently in the throes of curating a large-scale contemporary painting exhibition that will premiere at the Milwaukee Art Museum this coming November. It will then travel to institutions throughout North America. And I am delighted to say that Dyson's work will be represented along with the work of 49 other artists who are influential in the field of contemporary painting. This roster includes artists such as Amy Sillman, Mary Heilemann, Edgar Heeper-Birds, Rebecca Morris, Nicole Eisenman, Amy Sherrill, and many, many others. The survey exhibition will examine the cultural influences on contemporary art by going backwards, sideways, around, in, and over, and yes, sometimes, but only sometimes, by going forward too, as the critic Barry Schwabsky wisely states. So with that setup, it is my immense honor to introduce the exceptional artist, Torkwase Dyson. Dyson was born in Chicago in 1973. She broadly describes herself as a painter working across multiple mediums to explore the flow between ecology, infrastructure, and architecture. Many of my students in the audience tonight know well my repeated declaration that form is about organization and organization is always political. Dyson's work is the epitome of this. She invents form and rearranges power. Dyson's work has been the focus of solo exhibitions at the Serpentine in London, Colby College Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine, New Orleans Museum of Art, Louisiana, the Ross Architecture Gallery at Columbia University in New York, and the Landmark Gallery at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, just to name a few. Dyson has participated in many distinguished group exhibitions, including shows at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Drawing Center in New York, the Corcoran School of Art and Design, the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, and the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. In 2022, Dyson presented a newly commissioned work for the group exhibition titled A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration, presented at the Mississippi Museum of Art and the Baltimore Museum of Art. Dyson's work is represented by Gray Gallery here in Chicago and the Pace Gallery, headquartered in New York. Widely assessed, articles and reviews of Dyson's work have been published in the New York Times, Art Forum, Art in America, Apollo Magazine, and Hyperallergic, to name a few. In my 2019 Art Forum review of Dyson's work, I wrote that Dyson's paintings are both dynamic and multi-directional. Nothing slows down, not even the diagrammatic lines intersecting her shapes and compositions. Elements of the work run like water and crisscross fields of space like satellites. In the catalog essay written by Molly Seckerman-Hartung, to accompany the painting survey that I'm currently working on, Hartung writes that Dyson builds language and Black compositional thought from the connections she makes between geometric shapes and the lived spatial experiences of Black and brown people. Her work is improvised and weighty. It feels both awkward and powerful, struggling to think the critique of empire. And from an interview with Hans Ulrich Obrist, Dyson states in her own words that the history of Black spatial brilliance is tied to the survival of an ecological and environmental future. My work, Dyson simply says, is about forms that go after that kind of knowledge. Let us all welcome this extraordinary artist, Torkwase Dyson.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on this cool evening. I'm so happy to be home in Chicago giving this talk. I really thought a lot about how I would share my work in my hometown, and I thought that I'd try something different than I would usually, a different approach than I would usually take in other beginnings. And I'd like to share with you first a stream of photographs that I take, that I borrow, that I grab, to just give you a sense of what I absorb as a human being walking around the planet now. Things that that are arresting to me, things that are curious, and things that sort of work their way back into the studio. So I'm going to show you a system that's very internal, usually in my work, and I hope that you enjoy the first part of the lecture. And after this series of slides, I'll go into a more elaborate discussion about my individual practice. So I'm going to let these slides kind of roll while I read you some notes that I have. Okay. I think of myself as a meditation painter. I begin with all the thoughts, all the praise, all the anxiousness, all the guilt, all the love, all the fear, all the pleasure, and all the waiting. The world that I witness makes me feel all sorts of different, dispersed ways. But always in my studio, there's the act of distillation, taking what I understand to be true, long, soft, hard, confusing, old, new, taking it all and dispersing it across drawings and paintings, across thoughts and poems, across dreams and my imaginations. When what is left in my imagination, in my thoughts, and in my imaginary is line, then I know that the distillation is working. I am left with a line that talks back to me, that speaks back to me with confusion, sometimes annoyance, sometimes confusion again, and it loops around. I see the world through line. As I follow this line that sometimes mistrusts me and I mistrust it, I follow it into a form. I follow it into the curve. I follow into a rectilinear condition. I follow it into a curvilinear condition. As I walk around this world, from continent to geography, from map to place, line, curve, form, nature, air, senses, science, always, always speaks back to me to say, yes, I am here, I am a witness, I belong, I am activating in this space. I'm interested as I move across these projects, as I am invited to different sites, thinking about the history of these sites, who has been witnessed here and who has left different kinds of prints. I work these things back into my studio. I work into the memories of people that I've worked with. I work them into the very fingertips that then take up these materials. These kind of memories of materials, I know they're indelibly tied to my being and knowing. So it's here I start. I start as a witness, as a person that belongs in the world, as a person that takes each step, each place, each person into my space, and then I distill it, right? I'm in there, I'm working, I'm thinking, I'm letting it all spill out, right? So I think I live in the witnessing world and the belonging world, initially in the practice in a very generous way, right? I try to give it all, I try to ask it all, I try to really think in a condition of deep, deep looking, right? So I'm interested in these notes as I sort of move through these images. And then when I'm working in my studio, I completely open my phone, I open my laptop, and I start thinking through this device and the images I've taken to remind myself that there's a larger belonging before I get to the drawing, before I get to the painting, and before I get to the sculpture, right? These works are 9 out of 10 times done in a very, very deeply quiet space. So I need these thoughts, I need this sort of input, I need this relationship to remind myself that the discursive space is my form, right? The movement in every direction, the movement all over the space simultaneously, and this idea of building the fortitude of practice that can handle that much information takes time, it takes organization, and it takes systems. And when I land at witnessing and I land at systems, I'm allowed to give myself the space of improvisation. And that's when the keys start opening up the door in this space of improvisation after the systems are established. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and go into the work. Okay, so what I'm going to do by way of sharing with my hometown, I've loaded too many slides. So what I'd like to do is share with you, sort of go through the paintings, go through the drawings, go through the sculptures, go through the installations pretty generously, and then read to you the things that I write while I'm working in the studio. And then towards the end of the sort of rolling slides, I'll stop and talk about a few projects in detail. But I really want to share the breadth of my work because I assume that this space, this moment for me is about a kind of generosity. And please, if you have any questions and you think of anything, I'd love to have a full-on Q&A at the end. Okay? So. Here we go. So first, titles. So in my practice, I work my way to titles, right? From all of this space witnessing and all of this understanding in the world, I come up with these titles and I think through them. And they often come before the work comes. They often come before the project comes. And oftentimes, if I'm in a series, I'll then go back and change and adjust my titles based on things that might impact me. So I just want to sort of go through the working titles in my practice at the moment. A liquid belonging. Liquid a place. I can swallow the distance. I belong to the distance. Way over there inside me. I am everything that will save me. Closer. Factory. Plantational scene. Ships. Forts. Enclosures. So the thing that I'm really interested in thinking about materials, surface, form, right, and keeping my sort of register at the condition of the discursive is really an exercise again. And I think in my studio, what works for me is within these systems is thinking about scale as a really critical factor and a really critical body politic. So oftentimes in the studio, I'll work with things that are things that I can handle, things that I can move, things that I can put in my bag, things that I can put in my briefcase. Materials or I'll say graphite, which I often use, graphite that's in a powder or in a liquid that I can take with me everywhere I go. And I set these systems up on small desk and large desk, but oftentimes when I'm on a small desk and I'm reaching for things, I want to make something that's the size of my purse, right? That's the size of my purse that I can understand ideas of nomadicity and movement in relationship to the quotidian. So this might seem a little bit strange in the ways in which I think about, okay, I grab this bag, I put my shit in it, and I move around the world. But what I've developed out of this idea of scale and scale shifting is what I call the tiny desk drawings. And then this sort of tiny desk space where I understand that I have a limited time, a limited scale, a limited surface, a limited material, I sort of lock myself in another kind of system, and that is a material system, right? So I lock myself in this system and I sort of go at it. And what's important about, always carrying the images that I shared with you in the beginning throughout the process is to know that always the base of my entire practice right now is this idea of liquidity, movement, state change. So a lot of this work, whether it's the small paintings or the large paintings or the large sculptures or the architectural forms, begin with ideas of water, right? With ideas of something that I can dilute and sort of move across the surface. And I know over the time, those things will fixate on that surface. And then that surface over time will change and crack. If I burnish it, it'll have these different kinds of luminosities all around it. And then I think to myself, what is abstraction? Like, what am I doing with these thoughts, these memories, these improvisational spaces? What am I doing with the curve, the rectangle, the triangle? How am I toiling with these systems over and over in this sort of scaled down system, right? And I find myself wanting to build these things and find myself into this small space, into this idea of construction, right? Where do I start? Where do I end? And that register in between, I start quietly and I end up, if I'm working hard enough or fast enough, in a condition of construction. And the adding happens, there's a sort of underpainting that happens, and then there's the burnishing of the lines, and then there's the surface that always, for me, it really speaks to an audienceship, right? What do I want audience to feel? I'm after this kind of visceral condition, this poetry of surface, right? All right, I'm gonna start thinking about how these smaller surfaces become these larger surfaces, right? And these larger spaces that are these embodied conditions. I'm gonna go back to the slides and try to slow it down just a bit. I think 10 seconds is better. Okay. So thinking about sort of the world I live in, how that makes it into the studio, thinking about how this practice makes itself into these systems and thinking through scale, how do I end up in these spaces and these projects that I really deeply learn from each time. And what I'm doing, and what I've figured out that I'm doing is I'm reaching for the phenomenological. I'm reaching in this sort of quotidian moment, in these registers of experiences, and these registers of systems, to this sort of phenomenological condition. And the phenomenological condition has become so precious to me as I understand more and more as I travel and, create these, huge research sort of challenges for myself. That we're all in what Christina Sharp talks about, this sort of wake of being, whether it's colonization, whether it's imperialism, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's dispossession. We're all sort of cloaked in the wake of that, trying to figure out how did these things happen? How did industrialization pull off the transatlantic slave trade? How did sort of the bending of a curve, a space like the door of no return, how did that curve get built for us, for our bodies, right? And how do these systems, how are they concretized over time through different kinds of materials, right? So I know and understand that I'm in the wake of that, whether it's environmentally, whether it's spatially, whether it's language, whether it's flesh, we're all sort of in the wake of that. And then I say, okay, I'm interested in being in the wake of that and actually finding how, in these ways, these quotidians are actually after consistent liberation, right? So if there's systemic oppression, there must be systemic liberation. And I'm in that zone of register, trying to condition myself in this relationship of a trans-historical systemic liberation practice. So now I'm going to talk a bit about my systems. Okay. Part 1. Ideas of distance. I am certain that the beauty in Black indeterminacy, from sound to science, from architecture to migration, will continue to guide our solutions to climate and forms that are deeply spatial, generous, and haunting. In this moment of environmental precarity, we will need to be both liquid and mountain, bird and lava. And it is this density of Black grace that will always be the thing that keeps us in our own humanity. 1, I've created a system of forms for this kind of thinking. I call this system Hyperships. I use these forms as force multipliers to investigate registers of Black liberation movement. I call this investigation Black compositional thought. I work in this context of trans-historical state change, the past, the present, the future. I like to think of this ecosystem as nowness. Nowness is always the thickest place from which to express my thoughts. From there, my agenda, again, is to draw myself into invention. This is form as the practice of liberation. This exercise opens me up. I have this question in my mind. How can a rectilinear system create a curvilinear circumstance? This is my question. A lot of this question is inspired by my mother, thinking about ideas in beauty, inspired by the question of dangerous beauty, the kind of beauty that shifts, changes, and pushes colonization, imperial conditions, dispossession, white supremacy. Like, how do we create the kind of beauty that begins to dismantle these ongoing systems? It's through practice. Spaciousness. Thinking about ideas for a second, I want to go back to scale and talk about this form. Not only do I write myself through these titles, but I also write myself through poetry that I write pretty intimately in my studio. In that piece on distance, that phrase, bird and lava, I wrote that because I was trying to figure out how to create a discursive condition in my practice and how to keep myself there, right? So sometimes I say, well, Torkwase, one thing at a time, one, sort of form at a time, one painting at a time, one drawing at a time, one material at a time. And I remind myself that it's okay to be in that thick space, right? It's okay to be in that all over, all the time, precarious space. And so when I think about bird and lava, and I think about the polar opposites and all of the registers in between, I'm interested in that idea of the micro and the macro and how we experience it with our bodies. So the forms, the circular systems and the rectilinear systems are these sort of large pieces that are meant to be embodied. They're meant to be experienced, and perspective is meant to shift, right? You're meant to be in this sort of condition of figuring out your body in relationship to the materials and the scale. But you're also meant to look deeply in this small, quiet way, right? So I want to invite audiences in to slow down, right? And be in a space, but at the same time, it's okay to run around the thing, right? Be sort of jet curious around a single object. So objects themselves have different time systems in them. So how do I create a painting, a sculpture, object, an architecture that has registers of different times, right? So I do that in holding myself accountable to say, how do I think about scale as power? How do I think about composition in this sort of legible way in relationship to the built environment, like the world we live in, right? How do I think about the doorknob the same way I think, and I mean this, in the way that the things that we hold in our hands every day in relationship to the extraction zones, things that are at a site, right? So how do we relate the things that we hold in our hands to the things that are completely out of sight? We relate to them by everyday experiences, and we relate to them by research, and we relate to them in our imagination. So these forms are between what you know, or what I know, and what I can imagine. So I made this painting. I want to stop for a second after my dear friend Greg Tate made his transition. And one of the things that I've learned to do with all of the work and the research that I've been diving into over the past, 4 or 5 years, is to look at something I can't believe, right? It's standing in front of me, or I'm looking at an image of, and I can't believe I can't get to it. I'm not sure why the decisions were made. It's a mystery beyond my understanding. So I was working in Shanghai, and I was making work about water, about the river, right, about the Zhangzhou River, and how movement and bridges and architectures and histories of belonging to the river inform people's lives and daily lives. So I come across this image of a large mountain, and I see on these large mountains these sort of architectural forms that are simply sort of hanging on these mountains. And I'm not sure, no one is, how these, I'll call them cases for bodies that have made transitions. And these forms are sort of in this mountain, and they're sort of randomly placed. And the beauty of this is that I can't imagine how these decisions were made. The material, the placement, the gravity, the engineering, the love or the despise condition, that I have no idea. So the only thing I can imagine is what would it be like to be a transitioned human there. So my dear friend had made his transition. And the word that we used oftentimes in our conversation is this idea of the massive. And it clicked in one way, like this kind of cultural condition, this cultural handling and response to lived bodies was massive to me. So I wanted to make a painting, I wanted to make a series of paintings, dedicate them to Greg, and think about what does it mean to be in a condition where you're trying to figure out the phenomenological, you're trying to figure out the existential, you're trying to figure out the cultural, you're trying to figure out these habits of the everyday. But what I knew, to me, looking at this image, it was something sort of just so beautiful about this kind of belonging in this space. And so I decided to make paintings that question this metaphysical, phenomenological, architectural, environmental, scale-shifting wonder. And I thought that I would try to continue to reach this idea of the massive, this idea of the indeterminable, this idea of the things that are constantly expanding, like the universe that we live in. So I really was intentional about both laying the canvas down, and that's just the way I start most of my paintings, pouring them with water, pouring them with the liquid, having meditations, thinking about the things that I think about and go through my mind as I'm making a painting. And then these liquids dry on the surface. Then I go on top of these liquids and think about these geometries. And then these geometries in my, setup of the hypershapes, I allow my space for improvisation, myself to improvise around these drawings and to get something in a shape that's indeterminable. And then I know that I want something physical. I know that I want something that reads in the round on those surfaces. So I load my brush up, I load my palette up, and I go with these sort of marks. And when I ended and I looked at these paintings, I was like, and I want to speak to this, I was like, oh, I'm not making a painting about coffins on the side of a mountain. I'm making paintings about the way in which Greg used to talk to me about rhythm. That's what I'm doing, right? And the work it took me to get there is this condition of holding myself to the discursive, having these conversations and pushing myself so that these paintings talk about, and I'll say in the history of painting, both this expressive moment, both this moment of geometries, and all of them living in one place, right? How does painting function? Painting can function in this condition of discursive, even within the history of its forms. So I want to take a minute and dedicate this idea to an ever-growing expansion of the universe that now my brother Greg is a part of. I'm going to put these back on. Autoplay. Okay. So the making. It's the ins and outs of the refusal that dance with me in my dreams and my nightmares. The movement in, through, and around, belonging, staying, ongoing. The liquid everywhere liveness seeped in blackness. Like that south side sun, you know that touch from eons away, thick and good and beautiful. The thought of that blackness, that distance, that discontinuous indeterminacy, it makes me quiet. It makes me look for the line in clear water. Poem 2. The power of seeing deep and far and wide and close and narrow and quick and slow with love. The deep, the deepness up against what I am calling ocular brutality. When you create the enclosures to close off the light, to close off the corners, to close off the howling, to close off the sound. This brutality seeps in architecture. We defy it, we refuse it. We see far, we see long, we see constant. We see by and by. So I'm interested in forms that create a condition of perspective, but also allow a force of density and space. I'm going to go back just a little bit. That allow a condition of density and space that talks to that ongoingness, that talks about that indeterminacy, that talks about that force multiplier. And for me, abstraction is a force multiplier. It's the thing that I use as a tool. It's the thing that I use to take things apart, right? It's the things that I use to also make things go further and faster and longer and wider than I can do with my little hands working on one individual thing, right? So how do these forms become tools that we use to think beyond ourselves, right? Beyond ourselves, front and back, right? Here we are in this trans-historical moment. This piece is titled Way Over There Inside Me, thinking about ancestorship and its spaciousness, in the ways in which migration is still ongoing, in the ways in which people are trying to move in force far and distant away, trying to hear each other in winter and summer, trying to hear each other as we move through and along this condition of the condition of a continued liberation practice, right? How do you create conditions beyond measure that take up what we know from our history of movement and then embody it into new movement and practice that condition of knowing in systems that take both traditions, right, and ritual, and how we understand going inside the self and creating cultures that affirm us and love us and keep us close in sociality. How do we do that and continue to think about scaling up our own industrialized freedom? What does that look like? What does new world building look like in a scaled up condition, right? That's what I'm interested in this piece. So way over there inside me, I understand that the spaciousness that all of these conditions of systems of dispossession try on me, they fail, I refuse them. Thinking about ideas of composition and scale and constructing, I want to stop and talk about this paperwork for a moment and think about what does it mean in my practice to construct things that are moving from the two-dimensional space to a three-dimensional space, right? And thinking about looking over and through. These works came out of me thinking about collage. And collage is a way to think about transparency, opacity, to think about language, to think about movement, to think about touch, and think about state change, right? So what you're seeing is heavy, heavy loads, again, of graphite that starts as a powder I add a liquid form, it becomes a paste. I lay that paste down and I draw with it, right? Here I am again drawing through this work, drawing through these thoughts. And when I was making these, I felt shame, right? I thought to myself, it's like, why do I feel so much shame in making this? What is shame? Where does it come from, right? And I realized there was something about me in the studio trying to think about like how sort of my lack of tools, right? And I felt shame about, not being, I don't know, some astronaut one day. And then I felt shame about, not knowing how to, I don't know, grow mushrooms. So these things kind of seep themselves into the studio, this weird condition of shame. And I know that I know how to make a painting, and I know that I know how to make a drawing sometimes, right? So with these works, this is a condition where I started just to layer and layer, and each layer, each additive functions as a way for me to get past this kind of shame of not knowing how to do these sort of life precarious things, right? And then in the studio, oftentimes when I'm thinking about my principles, like what are my principles as a maker, right? I study, I write, I draw, I talk to my friends, I think about material, I think about color, I think about paper, and I go into my world where I feel secure, right? And then this mushroom sneaks in somewhere, right? And then it's throwing me off, right? And then what does it mean? Like, oh my goodness, I didn't have enough water today, right? So what does it mean to make work through this agony? For me, it's collage, right? For me, it's taking paper. There's something about the ripping of it. There's something about the turning of it. There's something about tucking something in, right? And then I realize in collage, I can hide, right? I can hide, I can put away, and then I understand I can create my own enclosures, right? And I can create these enclosures in a way that's safe and good, and I understand the construction, and I can take it apart and put it back together. Then I find myself in this sort of archaeological realm, right? Where the unknowing, is driving me almost crazy, but the digging and the construction helps me, right? Helps me believe in the sociality of the world that I live in. Like there is someone that grows mushrooms. There is someone that understands space, right? And somehow these are connected to them. Like these are even though I make them in this very quiet place, these are the most social for me, right? I haven't figured that out, catch me in a few years, but that's where I am right now in thinking about these. So when you see these, you know I've been struggling over mushrooms, yeah? Okay. You see, I only have one of those in there, right? I think they're great, though. Okay, there we go. So these are a few of the tiny desk drawings. So the reason why I started making these tiny desk drawings again, and I want to just think about this because I'll be in the classroom tomorrow pretty deeply and talking to students tomorrow pretty deeply. So I gave myself an assignment, and I said, I'm going to buy a small, sort of, I don't know, like an envelope kind of package. And all the information that's going to go on these drawings will have to fit in this envelope package, right? And whether I'm on a plane or whether I'm, in the hotel room somewhere or I'm visiting someone, I know that I can unfold or open up this package and create these tiny desk drawings, right? And what happens and what has been happening with them is that I've questioned or asked myself, what does it mean to sort of draw these monumental conditions on a 9 by 12 piece of cardboard? So for me, perspective, weight, line weight, contrasting conditions are really, really important to teach myself in this small containment of a space, how do I think about monumental ideas? How do I think of, monumental forms? How do I keep myself and remind myself that even though I am working from this small desk, the projection of my imaginations and my own research are still available to me in this condition of scale, right? So here, abstraction for me takes hold again. Because when I'm thinking about these, I realize I'm thinking about distance, I'm thinking about oil rigs, I'm thinking about pumps. I'm thinking about these things because I dive and see these things, right? So I think about what does it mean to be able to engineer that kind of density. So I bring density over the page. What does it mean to be able, as a diver, able to control my own buoyancy? So I bring a kind of precarious weight into the page. So the drawings are formed in this sort of imaginative space, but about a kind of politic that I lived with my own body, right? So questions of scale, questions of weight, questions of line, questions of space, questions of volume make it into these these tiny desk drawings. Another set of drawings that really had me thinking about abstraction. And I want to share this little story with you as I talk about, how are we on time? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I want to talk to you about these sets of drawings. And so Scenes of Subjections is out again. If everybody wants to get a new copy and reread it like I did, I just want to say that on my reread, I now understand that Saidiya is a sort of master of understanding abstraction. And let me tell you why. So one of the conditions in the book that she talks about, it's this idea of like how the enslavers treated the enslaved at the coffers, and how these conditions of these owners would treat and force these bodies to do things and faces to do things diametrically opposed to the condition that they were in. For example, if I'm being taken from the plantation that I've been living at my entire life, away from my family, and I'm going to be sold to present myself as healthy and well, I'll have to dance, I'll have to sing in complete agony, right? And then she talks about this as this condition of oppositional consciousness, this sort of abstraction, right? So I'm thinking about, as I'm reading Scenes again, and really honing into the way Saidiya Newley thinks about abstraction, I understand that she's talking about a legal abstraction and an illegal abstraction, right? And that legal abstraction is the way in which the owners can force a body to do something that's not true, right? It's legally sanctioned for this person to make another human being sing a song or dance in complete agony. That's legal abstraction. Illegal abstraction is when that said body speaks out against that ownership, right? That speaks out against that condition that's been set up to dilute people of any kind of personal autonomy, right? That's illegal abstraction. The kind of condition where I take it upon my own consciousness to find my liberation, even in the confines and the enclosures of dispossession, right? Even in that small, tiny space, I find liberation. That is what I'm thinking about as illegal abstraction. We have to fight legal abstraction, the abstraction of bodies that have been dispossessed to perform something diametrically opposed to my own individual freedom. And we fight that with internal conditions where we speak out, we resist, we refuse within the enclosures that we have to create conditions of liberation. So I'm struggling with this idea of legal abstraction and illegal abstraction now as I think about this condition of oppositional consciousness, right? Into what scale or what registers is it operating in now, right? So I made these drawings thinking about the new text and thinking about this idea of scale and movement and space. in relationship to scenes. So one of the enslaved women in scenes, her job was to work in the kitchen, and she was a quiet individual, kept to herself most of the time. And one day, her self-imposed owner tried to be aggressive with her and tried to sexually assault her. Well, she came out of nowhere, hit him, and did what she needed to do to get away. Then he put her up for sale, right? And on the auction block, which is oftentimes I think of auction blocks as geographies of Refusal, and Catherine McKintrick, who talks about how human beings reject and refuse from this condition of dispossession, from this space, from this architecture of hyper-capitalist economy, these auction blocks. How do you refuse from that space in bondage? And what this individual did after she refused her captor, she said from the auction block, as they were checking her teeth, as they were checking her body against her will, she said, "You're checking my teeth, what about the teeth down there, right? What about the teeth down there? So if you touch me, right, you're going to get bitten," right? In this refusal from that space. So I'm thinking about that moment of illegal abstraction, that moment of claiming her own body, claiming her space on top of this auction block, on top of this condition where she was supposed to have no voice, no view, no nothing, right? So these kind of conditions of the auction block as a space of refusal where people speak out from the space of complete negation of what you think my brain and my consciousness can do, and instead I have a voice, I have a place, I have a being, I have a body. And to think about that, going too fast, to think about that space and that block as a space of, an example of how we find liberation in these conditions is what I'm thinking about. And that idea in the book really, really sort of sets me on this idea of oppositional consciousness in those moments. So I'll find in these sort of architectural spaces, in the scale and the sort of randomness of the auction block, whether it's a stone or a bench or a table, anyone can deem an auction block, right? And anybody who sees those auction blocks, they're locators, they're symbols of these sort of, racial capitalism that perpetuated in the South particularly, but all over the planet, right? So when I was making these drawings, I felt myself getting closer to understanding the spaciousness of human perception, even on those blocks. Right. Start there. Right, so I'm going to start another conversation. So this series is entitled, "I Am Everything That Will Save Me." And so I've taken the rectilinear form and the curvilinear form and merged them, and by way of asking questions about Black compositional thought, whether it is the ocean, whether it is the slave ship, whether it is the big house, whether it is the condition of Box Brown, who shipped himself to freedom. How do we create these conditions inside of ourselves that continue to self-liberate? Which brings me to Black compositional thought questions around liberation and painting. What kind of expansion can a painting hold? Can it bring into our existence, what kind of expansion can a painting hold? Can it bring into our senses how encounters become scale and refusals textured? Becoming and being Black is a movement, a state change, an evolution, a quanta, a distance. Black distance is a form of knowing indelibly tied to liquid. We know who we are in the discontinuous expansion of blue and black questions. What are the spatial dependencies of a curvilinear liberation? How does distance influence composition made from the oceans rising? The cantilever of black sensoria is the whole ethos, a mark, a line, an enclosure, an edge. Freedom is composing a painting with precarity that keeps blackness close over time, across, under, and with an edge. So I'm going to round this talk off with some of my new works, where I'm trying to think about these forms that I've been talking about, and merge painting and sculpture together, and make work that is to be embodied over time, and think about my relationship to my practice and where I am now. And the aim is to really create a condition where the arch between architecture, painting, and sculpture is completely blurred, where the shape language from the Hyperships live their way through and with Black compositional thought, where I can see my practice and see these works coming into a kind of being that's massive from this sort of indeterminable place, right? So this work, I just, finished it quite literally this Friday. In the desert, it was the first time I'd worked in the desert. And this was a project with Desert X. And I landed here in this form, through all of the, drawing and the paintings and the curves and the textures, and thinking about how do I now begin to think about this phenomenological condition from the quotidian in the way that speaks to a geography of time that is beyond me. How do I think about an architecture that in it has conditions of ancients, or feelings of ancient architecture, feelings of contemporary architecture, and feeling of future, right? Now. And how do I get people to experience this work in the round from every direction, so that I am everything that will save me, that way inside me over there, that closer, all of this work hopefully is hosted in this new form. So I'm thinking about way of how do you occupy this architecture as well. So I thought about walking through a painting. I thought about walking through an architecture. I thought about walking through a sculpture. And I made it so that even though these were, this piece is sort of nestled in this beautiful mountain range, initially I will say that this was supposed to be cladded in reflective material, and I really wanted the geography to be reflected on the surface of the work. And as site-specific installations go, when I saw the reflective material there, it just really viscerally, I said no, and I took it down. And it was real about instinct and improvisation, thinking about this in the way in which musicians often think about it, like no, not, stop, look, and listen. Like listen to the place that you're in, right? Look and figure out some other register, because this isn't it, right? The material was not working. The sun was saying no. Everything was saying no. So I took it down and I just said, just paint this thing. Put paint on it, put 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layer, 4 layer, and just add that painting process as a meditation. Just work your way till you don't feel like you can paint this thing anymore. So it wasn't 1 layer, it wasn't 2 layer. It was to paint this thing so you can't paint anymore, right? And it arrived at a visual density that I said I could, say thank you to the universe for, right? So this sort of instinct and response to the site, response to this constantly working space, sort of rejected my initial, in the space itself, rejected my initial instinct is to say, well, let me sort of really think about and feed back to these mountains, let me think about how to reflect them in this space through this object. But that kind of level of ancestral refusal really landed on my head, right? So I said, no, let's strip it down. And this is what I was, obviously not left with, but this is what came out of it, right? And I think about this piece as beautiful and quiet and hard and tough. And I'm interested in the ways in which, the ways in which that work, I'll say this. When I think about sculpture, architecture, and painting and drawing as this sort of biosphere in my studio, right, as they feed into each other, I'm really interested in how do I, from those tiny desk drawings, make something where I really disappear, where distillation is actually happening, where improvisation is actually happening. And when I made this work and I finished it and I walked away, the distillation was so deep, I felt new, right? I felt fresh. I felt like I'd actually given over. And I had gone to a space where I wasn't, interested in calling it any kind of thing, that I was interested in really deeply trusting my audiences to figure it out, And it's living now, like on my brain right now, because I just left it, 2 days ago. And when I walk by it alone, it's the kind of form, when I think about my mind and what it can do in my brain and what it can do in my meditation, what it can do, I know that I've achieved distillation, And for me, that's an accomplishment, right? So now I'm going to end with a couple of paintings. So in this sort of realm of sort of making through these ideas of liberation and thinking about form as something that's liberatory, and thinking about it through improvisation and the traditions of sort of African American practices and music and liberation, I'm really turning to a space where the paintings have no beginning or an end. And this is that line space I'm thinking about, when that line is talking back to me. So all of these works, they start on the ground, right? They start on the floor. They're covered in colors and washes. And as I begin to think about these as what the surfaces will be, I have to go, and now I do. I know I have to go through this meditation prayer process of sort of drenching these canvases in a particular way. And then I feel like, okay, I can drench, and all of that agony comes, and I can just let it happen, and then I can distill. I can go to my graphite, I can bring it in, I can think about state change and surface, and then I can come back to that, and I can be as expressionistic as I can, and then I can model that into the garret, and I can think about Harriet Jacobs, and I can think about Anthony Burns, and I can think about these people, and I can think about what it is to think through sound and spirit and time. And I can land at these paintings that are also worked through all of that other practice and still end up at distillation, where you're not sure where one panel ends and the other panel begins. I'm starting to put canvases together, stack them, add the tiny desk constructions to the paintings, and really think about through ways in a space that I had not thought about them, particularly in my painting before. But that level, when I land at that line and I land at it speaking back to me, and I know that that kind of rhythm from one step to another. When I can hear that rhythm, then I can feel that I've achieved a condition of syncopation, right? And I know that the learning that comes from the drawing, the listening, the mapping, the building, both the ideas of embodied space, all of this can land on the painting, and I can achieve some kind of syncopation. And that's where I am in my practice right now, thinking about working towards understanding syncopation. That's it.
Nancy?
Hello. Okay, so I'm an architecture student, and obviously you said my favorite word a lot of times in your presentation, architecture. I am very curious, what does architecture mean to you? And not obviously semantically, but in your works, how are you employing these different skills of perspectives and planes and interactions? And I believe another word you used was systems. How are you controlling these systems in this imagined world of yours?
Sure. So the system I have set up for myself, and it's the Hyperships system, and it's a really sort of base geometric template that everything else sort of grows inside of. If you can look at the hypershapes as a seed. And the hypershapes are 3 specific shapes that come from 3 specific liberation histories. Harriet Jacobs, who hid in a garret for 8 years. The garret was in the shape of a triangle. I call it a rectilinear triangle. Box Brown, who shipped himself in a crate. I'll say this, that Harriet liberated herself in a found architecture, right? Box Brown built an architecture to ship himself away in. And then Anthony Burns, who hid in the hull of a ship, found this sort of reoccurring architecture because he went back and forth. So the hull is the curve, right? Box Brown is that rectilinear 90-degree angle, and Harriet is the rectilinear triangle. The irregular triangle. So what I've done by way of making meaning and shape and I'll say generating work, I needed to set myself in a condition of lived experience, liberation at different registers of being. So those 3 spoke to me, and they're an innumerable amount of liberation stories, but those architectures, the shape language out of them brings meaning into my work. And that equation I set to myself. Now, it depends whether it's the drawings, the tiny desk drawings, or the water or the gouache drawings. Sometimes I set a song. Oftentimes I'll set up a free jazz that'll maybe like 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And I'll understand in my own sort of assignment, you have 3 minutes to cover this page with these shapes. Or you have 4 minutes to create an image that has a 3-point perspective. You have 10 minutes to create an enclosure, right? So if I start with these seeds that are complete refusals of these systems, then I know if I draw over time, every day, almost every day, in a certain amount of time, my mind, my brain will create these sort of atomic habits that are in relationship to those liberatory spaces, right? So I set up a system, so I train my mind and my brain, develop these atomic habits, and then I can create these sort of improvisational conditions, right? So there's just like indigenous thought, you have the known world of spirit and science, and then you have a knowledge of it, and then you create a form that is liberatory. So architecture is a kind of condition that is ubiquitous, right, in a lot of ways. So I think of architecture or architectonics or architectural or ideas of enclosures being embodied in, right? Questions of what kinds of things what kind of things is my body surrounded in and locked inside of, right? What kind of movements can I perform or invent in these, depending on if I limit myself to the 3 shapes and 3 shapes on a paper or 500 shapes on a paper. If I think about these forms in creating a condition of enclosure, for me, that's speaking to an architectural condition, right? So it's both the system, it's the practice, it's the research study. So those oil rigs, right? Those oil rigs at the top, they're enclosures. At the center, there's infrastructure. At the bottom, there's artificial reefs, right? So that's when I understand how that works. I understand that architecture is also a tool where I can create this sort of biosphere and understand like all of these sort of connection and encounters. Does that make sense?
Torkwase, I have a question up to your left.
Hi, right here. I had a question, or I guess I was wondering about your use of the color black throughout the work and how it could possibly connect the ideas about abstraction and race, but also like anti-blackness and being black, but also in a color theory sense as well.
So I really, I'll answer this in the way I do, so in some compartmentalized way. So I'll say painters, we shade down, right? So oftentimes it's not actually a sort of black out of the jar. It's black is where I kind of get to with all of these colors, right? So it's a cobalt blue, it's a burnt sienna, it's a viridian green, right? It's all of these kinds of things. And if I need to hit it over, hit over to a deeper shade, sometimes I'll use like a carbon black. But it's the buildup of color that allows, and the water and the liquid from the paint, that allows this sort of spatial condition in the surface of the painting. Now, I say this because, water is clear, right? It's a clear material. And so when I'm diving, the deeper I get into the water, the less light, as I have access to. And so I understand that kind of, that depth perception of how light moves through water and how that darkness, happens. So I'm interested in that in relationship to the transatlantic slave trade and in relationship to what I'm thinking about now is this idea of the ocular brutality and how light in these sort of architectural ships was controlled. And so our ocular systems were conditioned first on this idea of light and dark based on these systems turning the black body into a material, right? Into a material, depending on its death, right? So all of these things around shipbuilding, crossing the Atlantic involuntarily, someone having control of your ocular condition the entire time over 3 to 6 months, depending, light and dark, no time. So that kind of, the ways in which our brains have been changed by that is what I'm interested in. I am thinking about becoming black on the Atlantic, right? In relationship to that light or lightlessness and the liveness in that. So for me, the choices of, libation, I'll call it libation, but libation on these works first. I got to that, right? And that libation and that prayer, then I work towards that. This distillation helps me get at that imagination, right? That space. But I know simultaneously the liberation is understanding that I can control the functions of my brain. Part of, slavery as a condition was the condition out of a consciousness, the condition of our brains, the gray matter, fear, anxiety, like all of these things over the years have set our atomic habits in a condition where they need liberation as well. So that's part color, blackness, being black. And what was the third inquiry around blackness?
Just color theory, I guess, and because when I was in introductory painting classes, they would tell us to not use black.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you a painting student?
Kind of.
Okay. So I'm going to say this. How do I say this? Don't use black out of the tube, right? Because what happens to you, so I went to Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi. I'm a Tougalooan. And Miss Gilbert was my first painting teacher. And she didn't let us use black, right? But I'm one of those people who found art and was like, whoa, this is the best thing ever. So I started, the class, but I would not use black. I wouldn't use that as a tool. So I had to get my shade, right? My greens, my earths, my soil. It's trying to paint, moss and ground. In Mississippi, the Tougaloo was on an ex-plantation, right? So I'm self-assigning landscape paintings, and I'm not using black. So I had to work my way to it, And I think that that's a principle, You can't, I'm still working my way to black. I'm still trying to get up there with the best of the blacks, So, yeah, get your palette, make it about the size of this, if not larger. Don't use black. Try to paint some dirt,
Thank you.
Seriously.
Nancy, there's a question behind you.
Back in, I believe, 2019, when you were visiting here in a lecture, you made a profound statement that I haven't seemed to shake since. And it was about the concept of time or temporality within Black traditions of art making and also culture, and Black and also diasporian, African diasporian cultures in general. But particularly within African American culture, how you said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that time is on a continuum versus the idea of a Western linear procession of time where past, future, present are circling in this continuum. And I thought about how the cylindrical, the circular, the round often appears more than other shapes, and you've kind of spoken on it briefly, but I'm hoping that you can take my bad paraphrasing and distill it a bit for us in that concept of time within Blackness and within particular African American history and the practice of art making.
Sure. So I'm not sure how I got there last time, but I'll start with Minnie Evans, painter. And I'll start with her because she is an ancestor that sort of popped into my mind. And her sitting by the gate, painting these beautiful, delicious, elaborate, imaginative images. And I think about her sitting by this ground and painting and what time it takes to put into those images over time. And then I think about someone like Alma Amos and how light is a condition, of travel and distance. And so when I think about time, I think about it, and again, in this discursive way. I know that time as a sort of science condition is different in relationship to where you are on the planet, where you are next to the core, where you are next to the equator, where you are in relationship to the poles, right? So time functions differently on our planet. So that's one way I'm thinking about time now. Another way in which I'm thinking about time in relationship to that is that the ways in which time happens in Black music and Black literature really always has me in the condition of this trans-historical space, right? So thinking about someone like, we'll just say Toni Morrison, and we'll jump around characters. We'll jump from like Beloved to like Pilot, right? So we know that Pilot, over time, found out that she actually had her father's bones above her head, right? To her adult life, traveling through geographies and traveling through love and traveling through becoming a mother. So I sense a condition of a timelessness in Pilot as a character. And then there's Beloved, who has an ongoingness, right? That energy is created, it is never destroyed, it's always happening. And then I'm reminded that everything that I am made of was some kind of form before, right? So my relationship with time now is to say that I understand it as a scientific condition that has to do with a biosphere that I'm interested in relationship to the sun and planetary conditions. But I'm also interested in the ability of our brains to really condition time in a different way, especially that black brain time defiance, right? That comes from becoming Black on that ocean, right? So I'm really, again, when I think about my work, these are the things that these are my dreams and my nightmares that I'm trying to work through with with this work, and thinking about, time helps me. But I will say, what's more difficult for me to think about in terms of Blackness is not time, is ideas of distance, right? So really distance has become my subject of inquiry, how distance changes, what distance can do, right? How time functions inside of distance. Because as a diver, you know that both your descent and your ascent has to be a particular kind of time-based condition. But that distance controls everything. It defines everything, right? So that trade, that distance defines so much. That deep blue, that distance defines so much, right? My own consciousness, that distance defines my time, right? So I'm really making and that's why when this title, like I Can Drink the Distance, I came up with that title when I was in Sharjah, I think, thinking about the Indian Ocean and thinking about other kinds of slave trades outside the triangle trade, right? But the Eastern trade and all of the things that are happening in death ships now, like that kind of distance, right? The ongoing, and Ronaldo talks about this, the ongoing emancipation. I got that wrong, but I'll figure out the exact phrase in a second. I'll work my way to it. Yeah, but that's what I'm thinking about, like how distance really informs time, right? If that helps. So I'm struggling with it.
Well, thank you so much, Torkwase. We'll end there because we're at 7:30.
Oh no. I'm sorry, I'm better at questions. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'll just say The Long Emancipation. Sorry, that's the name of the book. The Long Emancipation. Yeah.